We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. This is a pre-recording of a Twitter Spaces live event that we hosted last week. If you'd like to be a part of the next one, go on to Twitter/Palisades Radio, and you can be part of the conversation. You can listen to our conversation on the desktop, but it works better on the mobile app because then you can actually log in and ask us questions and interact with us as well. Just as a reminder, as always, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you want to listen to it, as well as Odysee if you don't enjoy using YouTube. I hope you enjoy it and hope to see you on the next one.
Go ahead, Alberta PhD.
Okay. All I want to say is I don't disagree with Mark there about, central banks have been massively irresponsible in, what is essentially experimental, theoretical policy over the last 10 years that has caused asset inflation. Inflation is not purely energy, but I do think that energy plays a massive role. And I just wanted to make a couple points with historical reference. What ended inflation, or at least what significantly contributed to the end of inflation in the 70s, was, yes, interest rates, but also a major shift in the way that energy was allocated. So in the early 1970s, 30% of the electricity generated, even in the United States, was generated with crude oil. There was a significant shift in the way energy was used from less efficient use of energy to far more efficient use of energy. The increase in the use of natural gas for electricity generation, as well as the proliferation of grid nuclear, all contributed to reducing energy-driven inflation. That's why oil went from up to 40 and then ultimately dropped into a range of 12 to 25 for almost 20 years. If you look at historical periods, like look at Weimar Germany. Weimar Germany was in a crack-up boom right up until the point where the country lost two things. They lost the Ruhr, which is where all the coal was generated. So they lost their ability, they lost their energy access at the time. They also lost a major agricultural region, which had, of course, dramatically impacted their ability to feed themselves. So yes, they had hyperinflation before they lost their productive capacity. But when everything became truly destructive within the hyperinflation was when they lost their productive capacity. And I think that people who look purely at one or the other miss the broader picture, which is inflation will essentially run away if you cripple productive capacity. And that is what we have done progressively over the last 10 years. I think when you look at the impact that energy has on it, it was substantially mitigated by the U.S. shale oil boom, which was facilitated by essentially free money that shale drillers could set on fire, drilling wells that were uneconomic. That's done now. And so in the absence of that, in the absence of some form of productive capacity growth, and the access and use of energy is productive capacity. Yes, of course, there's other things. There's farming, there's all these other things, but they're all facilitated by hydrocarbon production. When you hobble the ability to create primary energy that the economy absolutely needs in order to function, that is when inflation will get out of control. And so that's what we're facing right now. And my only pushback is that people think that there's somehow going to be a resurgence of productive capacity. And if you look at the commentary from oil and gas CEOs and the ability, it's not just they won't bring on things. It's that they literally can't. One of the previous speakers said, people won't invest in a new refinery. No, it's much worse than that. even if you had all the money in the world and you wanted to spend it to build a new refinery, you're never going to get a permit for it. You literally can't increase productive capacity, even if you wanted to and had the capital to allocate to it. That's all I want to say. Thank you for your time. You guys do your thing.
Yeah, to your point on what I said about they don't want to invest and allocate. So a good example, and I totally agree, but you made some very good points, Alberto, so thank you for that. Here's just a prime example of what the energy sector is up against. And so you look at Mountain Valley Pipelines, which is up in Marcellus, Utica area, Appalachia area. This is a project that got federally permitted in 2017. And so they got the approval from to basically build out the pipeline. And this is a major capital expenditure. And so in 2018, the project, as they're laying the pipes, digging up the earth and doing what they need to do, this project ends up getting sued. Now, remember, this was federally an approved project. And so as they're building out these pipelines, they get sued in 2018 by a bunch of environmentalists in the state. And so the whole project gets held up, okay? And so as the project's held up, they're now in court and costs are still there. And so to this day, so they were hoping to have this project that got federally approved in 2017. They were hoping to have it online in 2019. Now, fast forward to 2022, this thing's still in court. Now this project that started with a certain budget has a $3 billion cost overrun because of environmentalists, lawsuits, getting held up in court. It's still held up in court. They're still hoping that they can get these pipelines up and running sometime in, I think it's 2024. But now, so this is the kind of hostility that you're facing from ESG, environmentalists, local politicians, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're a capital allocator and you're in the energy business and you're a refiner, you want to start a pipeline for takeaway capacity, which we desperately need in some areas. You want to produce more oil, whatever it might be. They are so cautious about laying out capital because of the amount of money that is being lit on fire. And so that's one of the things that is holding production back in a huge way, not least of which that we're running out of easy tier 1 type wells. And so it's astronomical, the hostility against fossil fuels, which is really what's given civilization the kind of prosperity that we have. And Mark, you make some good points too, and I would just like to point out that I totally agree with you. Our central banks, our monetary authorities, and our central planners at government levels completely jumped the shark. And it's for sure not just one thing versus other. It's not just energy. But I would also push back that some of the debt is a function of a lot of the malinvestment that we've seen because we've had cheap and abundant energy. And when you have cheap and abundant energy, in that surplus of energy plus ludicrously low interest rates, which is what you're referring to, for sure, monetary is equally responsible for where we're at. You're going to see malinvestment. You're going to see debt. You're going to see projects built that shouldn't have been built, that would have never been built. And now that we don't really have cheap and abundant energy, all those chickens are essentially coming home to roost. But it's a great conversation. And so I think both of you have very valid points.
Tom, I'd like to just interject one thing, if you don't mind. Just
go ahead, Steve.
We tend, and I'm guilty of this, so I'm not saying anybody else, but we tend to get caught up in the outside layers of the onion in our analysis. And when I try to get down to the core, and the core kind of supersedes all the superficial kind of things that are happening, even though they are good indicators of what is happening. I try to continue to pull myself down to the core information, because then we understand. I look at the refining capacity in the United States. We just don't need it, because in the late 90s, the utilization of the refining operable capacity was 95, 94, 93% for many years. Last year, it was 90.2. We don't need the refineries. So instead of building a new one, the permitting process could be a hassle. The companies have just decided if they're going to shut down a refinery, they're going to expand what they have. And again, we're currently running at about 90.5, 91. We're still 4 or 5% below what we were 22, 23 years ago. So there's no issue with refining capacity. The problem is these companies like Chevron and Exxon, they realize that we're running out of limits. So no one is stupid enough to invest in a new refinery when you don't need it. And so I think, you see, this is how I look at it. I could be wrong, but when we understand that these companies have gone into quadruple the amount of debt in the last decade, and they really haven't brought on a lot more production as per se what this debt has brought on, you begin to realize that the resource that we're counting on, oil, is in serious trouble. And if oil's in serious trouble, well, then all the other energy sources are going to get into serious trouble. It's just a matter of time.
Just a tiny pushback on refinery utilization. Because no new refineries have been built, you're talking about a whole fleet of refineries that are now 25 years older than your reference period. So when you have piping, when you have vessels, when you have equipment that's 25 years older, you often are not capable of running it as hard as you could if it were newer. And it's a normal thing. As equipment gets older and older, you have to derate it because you simply can't run it as hard.
That's a great point, Alberta. And, again, going back to something that Tom Luongo says, if you can't get the parts, the gaskets, the flanges, all of these pieces to be able to maintain your plants, never mind run them at full capacity, because of the shortfalls of the supply chain, that all starts to feed into it too, right? Mark Nelson, you had a couple points you wanted to make, mostly centered around the nuclear power argument that we were making earlier. So if you could explain to us things from your point of view, please.
Sure. Thanks for the invite. Hey, everybody. Mark Nelson. I trained as an engineer, but kind of got sidetracked into trying to save nuclear plants around the world from being turned off. Different reasons in different places, but in general, lack of revenue in the U.S. was a big thing, and political obstruction in other countries was the big thing. I heard that some discussions were going on in this group earlier on some of these topics, and somebody asked me to weigh in, so here I am. So on the subject of electricity markets, electricity wholesale markets are extremely new. They are newer than the vast majority of reliable power plants that we have around the entire world where they exist. So what we're seeing now in electricity markets is many of the plants that were built before the electricity markets under some form of central planning or regulated utilities, those are now retiring or being forced offline, either because they're genuinely getting quite old in the case of many of the coal plants that deal with extremely high temperature gases and therefore have a lot more degradation, or in the case of nuclear plants, which can be operated at higher and higher efficiencies through their life, in contrast to many other industrial facilities, because the temperatures are so low and they're so over-engineered that there's a lot you can do to keep a nuclear plant operating better as it ages, so that makes it sort of different. Well, those nuclear plants and the gas and coal plants that are having a problem in the markets, that is an intentional aspect of the way the market's designed. The people who designed the markets often did want the nuclear and coal plants closed, and they made market structures to induce these closures. And this was for various different ideological and business reasons, but it was still designed in that manner. What we're now seeing from a number of the electricity markets, they're realizing they seriously messed up. They are slowing down interconnections with a capacity like wind and solar that cannot support the grid operations in all conditions. And they are also putting on more and more layers of requirements, extra auctions on auctions on auctions for different features and capacities that used to be provided by the traditional power plants. And these markets are either almost completely failing, or they're looking more and more like the same management you had at the utilities in the past. So what we anticipate seeing from this point forward is, I'm going to call no more market-based nuclear closures in the US, and there were not market-based closures outside of the US, at least to the extent that the nuclear plants were highly competitive and they were being forced to close with extremely punitive taxes and interference from governments like we saw in Sweden and in Spain. I think that I'll leave the markets there, and if somebody has a question, I can certainly answer, but we're not going to see many of those market-based closures in the US, because even if natural gas does crash, the markets are now going through their first really big capacity crisis, so they're getting the institutional memory that the utilities used to have and the utility commissioners used to have, and they didn't have it before. The main problem that electricity markets were there to work on was killing nuclear plants, killing coal plants, not getting new ones built. So this capacity crisis that they're going through, this natural gas price crisis, is teaching these institutions, it's giving them the gray hairs and a little bit of a scraggly beard that's going to make them extremely cautious about approving nuclear closures in the future. Right. So moving on to decommissioning, evidently there was some confusion about decommissioning, about whether it takes really good personnel or whether you have to do it quickly. And I'll just say on decommissioning, there are no pressing safety issues involved in decommissioning. The speed at which you decommission, the number of staff you have decommissioning, is almost totally related to your business model for how quickly you want access to the decommissioning funds. It has almost nothing to do with safety, almost nothing to do with even the politics around decommissioning. So I think if I leave it there, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Mark, I was gonna ask you something. You know, if you're close enough to, let's say, the nuclear story, how far away do you think we are from a reasonable, let's say, Gen whatever reactor that is more efficient and more suitable to the needs of what we have today?
I'm enjoying that you're asking this right now, because I'm in the lobby coming out of meetings at the company here in Chicago that built a bunch of the nuclear plants in the Midwest back in the 70s and 80s. So the walls of their offices in the skyscraper in the Loop in downtown Chicago are filled with construction images of the folks who worked in that, working in those offices, building a line of extremely high performance, compact, very powerful nuclear plants that provide like 90% of the electricity for Chicago. So I'm in the right location to be in the mood to answer this. What I'd say is, I don't care about the particular technology pitch, or our reactor is going to be very simple, it's going to have few parts, or it's going to be small or large, or it's going to be made in factories. All of that is marketing nonsense. The problem is we've lost the ability to project manage and risk manage large, complicated projects that include a lot of people and a lot of capital. So our ability to have a product is less about having a product and more about having an ecosystem of finance, political leadership, and industrial leadership that's something like what succeeded in the past. And in the countries where we already see success today, again, without needing to reference which reactor they're using or whether it's Gen 3 or Gen 2 or Gen 5 or Gen 10, all of that is irrelevant to me. What's relevant is, do they have an effective set of finance, political, and industrial leadership? I'm sort of including regulator in there with political, but I don't think that's fair. The regulator here in the US gets a lot of stick for being so slow and hard to deal with and stopping our nuclear. But actually almost everybody at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is pro-nuclear. Almost everybody there wants to see nuclear succeed. Every time a nuclear plant closes in the US, NRC loses seats. They lose staff. They do not want to see nuclear closed. Instead, it's an issue of slowness and confidence in new work especially. It's an issue of misunderstanding the needs of the industry and not being able to deliver on very fast changes in regulatory structure because no one there is willing to take the personal or political risk of being on the wrong side of a safety incident. Right. So all of that is my preamble to say reactors are being built now quite effectively by a number of different countries. That didn't require some change in technology. If America is going to be reconstructing nuclear, building nuclear again in the US, it's going to come from better management of Westinghouse projects, better engineering management, better manufacturing, better political management, or it will come from something like General Electric Hitachi's X300 project. I am very excited about some of these so-called advanced designs like the sodium reactors. I think they are engineeringly interesting, scientifically interesting, but they require a great deal of novel abilities that we never even had in the first place compared to light water reactors that we're building, which will be able to partake in a lot of the wisdom and experience from our existing tech today. I'm also keeping my eye on things that are not even considered advanced. For example, CANDU reactors built in Canada or built by Canada or by outside parties that hold that technology like India. Those are going to be the reactors that I think are going to be extremely competitive in the developing world because there isn't a bottleneck around heavy forgings. The reactor vessel itself is broken up into small, much easier to manufacture pieces. And so it may be that what we're calling advanced will just expand to mean literally anything anyone's building, you have to call it advanced or no one buys it, in which case it'll use heritage technologies like light water and heavy water reactors.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate getting your viewpoint on that. Timber 01, you had your hand up for a little while here.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to dovetail on what Alberta Gorbage was saying. Mr. SRS Rocco report, I was quite taken aback by your declaration that we don't need any refineries. Crack spreads are at historic highs. They're in the mid-50s with historical norms between $10 and $20 are the crack spreads. And we haven't built a refinery in the United States since the 1970s. If you think that these $55 crack spreads are just engineered because they decided to do that and there's no supply issue with refineries, then I would request that you do just a little bit more research. I mean, we need refineries in this country and in this world. We're at $55 crack spreads. It was a ludicrous comment. I'm offended.
Well, you don't have to be offended because it's not a personal attack on you.
Well, I'm offended.
I personally understand and agree with you that we probably do need more refineries, especially, in a place like Alberta and Canada where we do produce a lot of oil, and yet we somehow still import a ton of oil. That doesn't make, logical sense. But again, if we can keep it respectful, that would be much appreciated, guys.
Always.
Okay, Joe, and I don't take it whatever you said about my analysis on the refining capacity. I'm not offended by it. I mean, everyone has their own view. I think my view tends to be a little bit longer because not only do I see when we're going to have plenty of refineries. Yes, they're older. They're going to break down. I get all that. We're going to have too many homes. We're going to have too much commercial real estate. And you see, all that functions on how much the blood system, which is the petroleum. So if petroleum production falls, then the ability to maintain a suburban economy of cars and trucks and buses, that declines. The GDP declines. This is just simple economics 101 if it's based on energy, not the way it's taught in school or in the universities. So I'm not saying we don't have old refineries, and I'm not saying that these refineries are lower utilization because they're older. What I'm saying is I think the energy decline in oil that's coming in front of us, it doesn't really matter. Because I think that's the problem, is that the overall impact of this, what I call the energy cliff, it's going to drastically change. Now, I could be wrong, but it's going to drastically change the world as we know it. And so a lot of the stuff that we have been conditioned, homes, all these things, I see that whole market is going to start to deteriorate. And so that's why I have a little bit of a different view. I don't see we're going to continue to plug away another 10 million barrels a day of production growth in the next 10 years. And then after that, we're going to add 10 more, and then we're going to be adding more nuclear. I think we've hit the apex. Now, I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, we'll know it within the next 5 to 8 years. And so that's how I kind of differ.
So just as a question, so you basically predict a precipitous decline in global standards of living, not because we are incapable of increasing our standard of living, but because you believe people will accept a decline in standard of living caused by fiat, essentially. Fiat as in like government policy.
No, if you go back in history, the Roman people, which are 1 million in the Roman Empire, did not want to collapse. And I can assure you the elite in charge of the businesses, even though a lot of people here believe that the elite want to take down the system because there's too many people, the elite need all the billions of people working to allow these global supply chains to work. And so the problem is the issue in the late Bronze Age and the Roman Empire, the medieval empire, is that the energy return on investment of the wood fuel, it peaked and declined. And so that's it. That's the middle, that's the core of the onion. So when you start to go out and look at all the details, we talk about money printing and debt and capacity utilization and nuclear power plants, it becomes very esoteric and difficult because you don't take it down to the core. The core is we're running out of high quality energy return on investment energy to run all this complex infrastructure, especially in China, that we've built up. And so people think we're going to continue to add to that. As I mentioned in my last Twitter Spaces, we're going to have problems just maintaining what we have. So I think that's more of the problem. It has nothing. And lastly, if people think that the central banks are the real ills of society, I have a little bit of a different look. The central banks, by money printing and adding debt, have allowed business as usual to go on longer than maybe it would have. So they've extended Walt Disney World, Walmart, and Starbucks for, the wealthier people. A lot of the people in the third world countries don't have that because the energy has been siphoned to us, and we've enjoyed that energy value. It made our lives a high standard of living, but it has nothing to do. The banks and the central banks have actually, even though they've created more wealthy people, they've actually allowed this system to go on longer than it would have. And the last thing I can say is one of the top scientists about the late Bronze Age collapse, he said that when it collapsed, the elite were wiped out. So this is an issue that the elite are not. They are susceptible and on a massive scale of what's happening. I see a lot of the elite wealth just evaporate over time. And so again, this seems like more apocalyptic, but you go back in history, how many empires and civilizations have collapsed? It's nothing new. We just want to ignore it. It's like people want to ignore death. Everybody's going to die. We just want to ignore the reality of the situation if you look at it logically.
So I have a slight pushback on that because, yes, I agree. Resources are by definition finite. We just don't know what the limits are. But what I can tell you is this, at least when it comes to hydrocarbon production, that we have not reached peak oil. What we have done is we have created policies that have prevented supply from meeting demand. Again, I would consider myself fairly safely an expert in the Canadian energy industry. And I have a pretty in-depth knowledge of the oil sands. And what I can tell you is that if the oil sands were allowed to run with regulatory breaks off and takeaway capacity breaks off, the Canadian oil sands could easily produce 10 to 15 million barrels a day. Now, I'm not saying they could do it in 1 year, but if we had kept up with new projects, with new pipelines getting built and installed, we would be steady marching up. I would bet that our production would be somewhere north of 7 million barrels a day right now, and it would still be going up. So the problem is not that we can't create a genuine high quality energy return on investment. It's that in many places we are prevented from doing so by fiat. It is not, as someone who works in the energy industry, I would love to be out there just smashing wells nonstop and bringing on as much production as I could, and I can, and I know that we could, but we have been prevented from doing so. So my pushback on the Roman Empire analogy, and not to say that our state cannot decline due to a true lack of available energy, but we don't have that. What we have is just dramatic mismanagement of our ability to access the resources we already have. And at a certain point, people are going to get really, really angry with the people who are forcing their standard of living down. The suppression of nuclear energy, I believe, is another example of people forcing our standard of living down to benefit certain entrenched interests. I mean, it is a fact that Harold Hamm, CEO of Continental Resources, funded the environmental extremist NGO movement in Canada to landlock our crude because he didn't want competition. So all of this to say, the problem we are facing today is not that there are not quality resources. I bet you Europe could be natural gas self-sufficient if they would just fucking unban fracking and let it happen. But they won't, because the leaders think they're omnipotent and that they can get away with anything. So that's my pushback on this whole thing.
Yeah, one of the things about humanity is we really do seem to find our way with ingenuity. If we were in the UK and we're burning biomass in the 1600s, and we're running out of wood, just it's becoming geographically too far away, and we're spending too much energy for our fuel, for our energy source, to feed ourselves, to feed our families, to grow. You would be sitting there around a campfire thinking we're doomed. It's over. And mankind, they found a way to grow. I mean, they discovered coal, which clearly has a super high energy return on energy invested. It's apparently around 30 to 1. So I'm a generalist, right? I'm not an energy expert, but I do my research. And so we discovered coal and humanity flourished. And we went from, a high dense, great energy resource to oil, to natural gas. And really that's, what we're built on today. And so I think we're at that moment where the wood's running out, but it's still there. And so I think, like, my question, I guess, is more of a question is for Mark, who understands nuclear more. How nuclear just seems to me would be that next step function up. We went from wood to coal that really gave a lot of human prosperity, a lot of wealth. Standards of living went up, productivity went up, and so it seems like if we went to a more nuclear world, given that the energy return on energy invested is so far superior compared to any energy resource mankind has ever utilized, how much nuclear could we build? Like, let's just, I guess, not consider the initial outlay, but that extra surplus of energy could really just set us up for the next sort of renaissance in energy surpluses, where you see mankind just take off like we've never ever seen before in our history, as an optimist speaking. And so, I guess, how much of a role do you think nuclear will be able to play going forward? And do you see the regulatory? I mean, I guess that was discussed, but it just seems like there's so many roadblocks and so much public perception. Do you think we can get there? I guess is my point, or my question.
So, great question. First thing I'd say is the uranium or thorium or plutonium, none of that's going to be the limitation at all. So uranium is a very interesting thing where I get along with the folks who love investing in uranium and talking about it, because if they make a lot of money because uranium price goes up, it's not going to kill off any nuclear plants. That's what's really good for me. If people were cheering on uranium prices in ways that would eliminate nuclear, I think I would not get along so well. But as it is, the raw uranium, the unenriched uranium contribution to the cost of running a nuclear plant is a small fraction, on the order of 5, 10, 15%, depending on how efficiently the plants run and what the uranium price is that we're talking about. The finished fuel, including the enrichment and conversion and manufacturing, all that stuff, to get that fuel into a reactor bumps its cost up from anywhere to approximately 10 to 25% of the running cost of a nuclear plant. And running costs of nuclear plants now undercut by a massive amount any other way of making stable electricity, except for the largest hydro that isn't having shortages. So nuclear is competitive on the basis of the fuels. No real limitation on the size of fleets, because whenever we need more uranium, we're going to be able to find it. And if we have any limits on uranium, we just go back to thinking like we did in the 60s, that we just have to make fast reactors that burn up much more, or even all of the fissionable isotopes, rather than just the tiny percentage that we use today. So I'm not worried about the fuel. To speak about one of the bigger limitations, public sentiment, what I want to see is a world where a nuclear plant can have a plain old industrial accident, have some core melt, maybe even be written off, and no one really cares. We aren't at that world. That is what 3 Mile Island should have been, based on the physics of the accident and the potential harm to the outside world. That is to say, very, very little. I got a little bit of pushback when I was describing the attacks at the parking lot of Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine in the opening days of the war. And I said, hey, if things really go badly and there's an intent to damage this plant, we might see 1 or 2 of these reactors have damage like 3 Mile Island. And some people said, hey, that sounds bad. And I had to point out that this is a war where probably tens of thousands of people are going to die. So a zero injury accident is really not so bad. But until the public kind of likes nuclear, or conversely, until the public has worse problems to deal with than how their energy feels to them in terms of vibes, then we're going to have political constraints on nuclear, because they are large, complicated projects that require long commitments. That is what can be interrupted by political opposition or new governments coming in and breaking commitments to other companies. I mean, that's what's held up nuclear even in places outside of the U.S. So there's the good side and the bad side. The good side is that young people aren't afraid of nuclear and they're learning to love it. The bad side is that a lot of pain is coming in the world, and that pain is going to make it not that interesting to talk about nuclear fear. Like, people will just be like, yeah, I have bigger problems. I'm not employed and can't heat my home. Who gives a shit about nuclear, like, safety fears? Just, does it work and can it turn on? That's what I care about. Those two things are the major sentiment improvers that I'm experiencing now in my work around the world on nuclear. So those things are going to be less of a constraint in the future. Then that finally brings us to pure human capital, the competency to have people in a complicated project understand each other, cooperate well, accurately deliver what they say they were going to, and have that be what's needed for the project. That's what completely broke down at Vogtle. We had a government that wanted that project, a state that wanted that project, a public that was at least fine with it. Almost everything that we need for nuclear to be a success seemed to be aligned at Vogtle in Georgia, and it turned into a complete disaster for a large number of the companies involved with it because people simply couldn't deliver the parts as specified. The specifications weren't complete enough, and just on-the-job labor productivity was in the dumps. You sometimes had hundreds or even thousands of people just sitting around because things on the critical path were just backed up and waiting, and nobody knew whose fault it was, who should be paying, who should be blamed. Lawsuits were going, they're still going. It was a disaster for reasons that are not uranium limits and they're not political limits, right? So those are the three things that are keeping nuclear from being as big as we would want it. The truth is nuclear plants as built are lasting for decades longer than we probably thought they were gonna. And since they're aging with extreme grace, they're aging into good performance rather than into bad performance. It seems likely, and I challenge engineers, whenever I visit a nuclear plant, I challenge the engineers on this. I say, all right, your reactor vessel is 38 years old in terms of operation. How is the steel? How is your steel? And they always have to say, well, it's in great shape. And then I say, does that mean you can keep operating? They want to shrug and dissemble and say, well, we don't know. We need to keep watching. But what I'm seeing is the reactor vessel is one of the only things we haven't tried replacing. If those last, we should be able to continue to operate nuclear plants of design sufficiently similar to today's for extremely long periods, perhaps permanently. So we're going to need to think in terms of very long time horizons and the benefits that will come for decades or even centuries. And at that point, I see it just being a human capital limitation on constructing nuclear. I do not see a physical limitation with either fuel or locations.
That's interesting. So would you say, like, Bill Gates started TerraPower, founded it and was the chairman in, like, I believe 2005, 2006, and they are starting a construction phase up in Kemmerer, Wyoming. And I guess the completion isn't the completion date they're shooting for around 2028, right? Which is still 6 years away. A lot of that was research and development leading up to this point. But would you say that that's part of the learning curve, and just also going to what you're saying, a lack of human intellectual capital and experience with this? Because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of roadblocks in Wyoming. Cynthia Loomis, the senator up there, seems like, she's very helpful with all these types of things, and they've really given the green light. But still, it's, this it seems like from start to finish, it's a very long curve.
Let's get out in front of this straight away. 2035 would be a decent result. Do not look for this thing by 2028. That is, I love nuclear. I'm fascinated by the TerraPower design. If people are still saying 2028, we're going to have to do a rearguard action on communications to apologize for that not being ready. No, and look, that's really, I see that as the TerraPower program has basically been embraced by the U.S. as getting back into sodium fast reactors. That is related to, but is not the same thing as delivering a lot of electricity to the whole country, however it works best. Like, the sodium fast reactor program should exist. All great nuclear nations have one or should have one. Russia has one. They can finally operate sodium reactors with some semblance of regularity. That's big. Almost every other sodium fast reactor program of commercial scale or near commercial scale had operational issues and was shut down before the country learned how to operate them. So that, I'm talking about France or US previously or UK. We've really had an issue operating commercial sodium fast reactors well, but you should not see it as like that's the big thing that's going to make sodium fast reactors take over everything. What it does do, it gives us some hope that if sodium fast reactors work and can be constructed commercially, then we never have to panic about running out of energy until the sun expands and destroys the earth. So that's our permanent ticket to energy on this planet if we have commercial fast reactors. It's just that isn't the constraint in the near term. In terms of constructing and TerraPower's journey really shows the journey that many folks are having learning about nuclear. When the reactor was first proposed, it was almost a complete nonsense reactor that wasn't ever going to work. And the reason why they went for that design is because it sounded like it would cure all the things that induce nuclear fear. You'd never have to refuel it, they said. So therefore, refueling is related to like proliferation. So you don't have to be afraid of proliferation because our cool reactor is going to stop proliferating because you won't refuel it, which is complete misunderstanding of almost everything from nuclear reactors to proliferation and public fear. Then they said, well, it'll breed up a lot more fuel this way and that'll take care of our fuel needs forever. I mean, I just endorsed that a few seconds ago. It's just that isn't the limit. And then they said it'll stop meltdowns, blah, blah, blah. Well, look, there are almost no nuclear meltdowns. Saying there is almost none and there will be none have almost the same meaning to a disbelieving and distrustful public. Furthermore, the culture of expecting absolute perfection from nuclear and saying if we don't get perfection, we shut down all of nuclear, completely misunderstands the public's tolerance for risks that they think are worth it or are moral, which is the public relations battle. So while I love the reactor design, I will watch it with interest. I wrote my thesis over it back in grad school. I'm not looking for that to solve the public relations issue, and I'm not looking for novel reactor types to be the fastest in construction. Because we have to learn how to construct nuclear at the same time. We have to learn how to work with these reactors. I mean, the nuclear design team that TerraPower is working with over at General Electric Hitachi is one of our closest living links to an almost mythological time now in the 90s, where enormous, complicated Gen 2, if we must use a word, or Gen 3, Gen 2 plus, whatever marketing language they want to use, boiling water reactors were built in Japan in 3.5 years. 1,300 megawatt reactors were commissioned, from pouring the first concrete to turning the things on and selling the power commercially in under 4 years. That was only the 90s, and some of the people I've talked to that are working with TerraPower were engineers working and assigned to those units that got built in under 4 years. We can physically achieve it. We just have to get back to enough veterancy among workers, veterancy among the rebar layers, the concrete pourers, the crane operators, the electricians, the carpenters on these jobs, the regulators who are looking over and need to be satisfied that things are going well. The project managers at all levels need experience again. The upsurge of interest in nuclear hopefully will give us the ability to get this experience, including on projects like TerraPower's, even if I don't think it's reasonable to wait for that thing before 2030.
I appreciate Mark adding all this insight into the nuclear industry. And I've read some reports, and that has been the major problem with the U.S. Nuclear industry is the ability for manpower and management to finish a project in an efficient manner. And that's been a major problem that we're not seeing that in China. China's a little bit differently, but I kind of want to always put it into perspective. What's nuclear power? It's electricity. And unfortunately, the world is the global supply chain is not powered by electricity. Electricity powers the homes. It powers manufacturing and industry and putting the nice lights on and in the computers at the big commercial buildings, at these big buildings. And that's what nuclear is good for. However, we cannot transition a liquid fuel based global supply chain because, we're all used to going on Amazon and I need to get a new computer or whatever, new pair of clothes. I hit a button and by gosh, if I want to, one day later, that material, that good is on my doorstep. Well, that's not electricity. That's liquid fuel. And so
I hear you. But just as we heard from Alberta a little bit earlier, I think it is accurate to say that coal, nuclear, and hydro kicked oil almost entirely off the grid. There's something to be said for the great oil and gas producing nations of the Middle East rapidly moving towards their nuclear programs. Today, you all should be looking for more information coming out in soon, in the following months, of Middle Eastern states, oil producing states, launching their nuclear programs after seeing the quite extraordinary success of UAE in its first 4 units. You should also look for more news from UAE. The reason I bring that up is because if you displace oil and gas from its current uses and let today's production capability serve a perhaps smaller but that much more high value and essential role, and you use nuclear to first do this electricity generation. And one of the things that would be good about some new reactor types is if you could operate them as well as we operate our lower temperature reactors, even though they're higher temperatures and that's more difficult, and you operate at those higher temperatures, you will be approaching the ability to provide value in the global supply chain is currently powered by liquid fuels using energy from nuclear along with some other feedstocks to start displacing the demand in that sector. So you're completely right. It won't be overnight. We've heard that from a number of speakers. The question is it not overnight and therefore we're doomed because things are happening now that will break us, or it's not overnight, but we have some time and can hold on. So for the optimists and pessimists, there is a route towards uranium being a primary energy supply that helps on an economy that is based on liquid fuels. But you're right, it won't be immediate.
If I could just chime in here to sort of support Mark's point and also along Alberta's thought process. Obviously, I think governmental regulation is a huge issue in the Western world. I think we're blessed with a tremendous high molecules. I'll just put it that way. So hydrocarbon, coal, nuclear. We have tremendous resources in North America. We are blessed with molecules, but government regulation has really put a hamper on the ability to develop those resources. I would say if you're worried about hydrocarbons, then to Mark's point, if you can get a nuclear build out and cut the red tape and get things done in less than a 15 to 20 year time frame, you could very easily cut back the amount of liquid fuel requirements simply by being able to roll out significant numbers of plug-in hybrids. I'm not talking EVs, I'm talking plug-in hybrids. Okay, so you can build 3 plug-in hybrids for every one EV when it comes to battery metals, etc. Obviously, we have a limit on our distribution system currently, so that would be part of the process. Now, you're talking to somebody who's really heavily invested in oil and gas, so I'm looking at the human aspect here, and I tend to bet on human ingenuity over the long run, over the doom and gloom aspects that some people are espousing. But at the end of the day, at least specific to North America, we have tremendous resources. I would say in a world where you believe that there's a finite amount of liquid fuel available and that's going to become an issue, then I would tend to think that those liquid fuels are going to flow to the places that have the best ability to pay for those. And I would argue that would be North America, that would be Europe, and the developed portions of Asia. So I don't know. I guess I have, and trust me, the people who are in this room who listen to me know I'm definitely a glass half empty kind of guy. That's the way I look at things usually. But I don't have this doom type outlook on the ability for the human species to be able to develop and provide the energy required. What I do have, that half glass empty outlook on is governmental regulation and interference in the free market being able to actually execute that and get things done. That's really where the problem lies, I think, across the board when it comes to energy and many other things in our society.
I wanted to comment one more thing on that after looking at the pictures here in this engineering office, where almost all the engineers who would have been involved building those Chicagoland nuclear plants, Byron, Dresden, Braidwood, LaSalle, back in the 70s and 80s, almost all of the engineering managers who didn't get a speck of dirt on their boots because that's not their role at these construction sites, they would have grown up working with their hands, working on projects, working blue-collar jobs, and then they would go off, get their engineering degrees, and work on a succession of larger and larger nuclear plants before getting to these monsters outside of Chicago. This is what worries me a bit. Almost everyone I meet in energy doesn't even have this, in my world, clean energy or nuclear or electricity markets, they seem to have almost no physical practical experience. And I think the lack of that tacit knowledge, that tacit wisdom of how things can break in physical worlds versus computer worlds, I think that was a lot of the chaos and destruction on the AP1000 projects in Vogtle. And I don't know how we build back people's ability to understand the physical world, especially as interacted with by laborers and foremen on construction sites. I don't think there's any way forward except for brutal experience.
Hi, I was just a question for Mark that maybe hasn't been asked yet, or maybe has been asked already. We're talking about political elites and their views on energy. Does anyone have any thoughts, or Mark especially, about Gavin Newsom's kind of semi-reversal or slight change in position on the subject of nuclear and what that might mean going forward and what symbolism it might have?
Sure. So that's been a major project of mine for a large number of years. So essentially, since I started working on nuclear in 2016, Diablo has been a major part of my life. And it definitely seems clear based on people we know who are close to the governor that he does not fear nuclear. He does not care one way or another. However, he also doesn't really care pretty much about anything. So it's just, he will go whichever the way the winds blow to be the easiest possible thing on any given day. If it's easier not to force Diablo to close, he won't close it. If it's easier to not work on Diablo and let it close, he'll do that. Our campaign has been about making it a little too hard for him not to at least address it. It appears that has been successful. So what's the next step? The question is, if actual, active, competent steps from him and his administration have to be actively taken in advance to not lose the nuclear plant, will they do so? I think they'll want to. They may not be capable of it. We'll definitely be there every step of the way, encouraging, to say the least, that it be done. But we're now into a time when there isn't that many months to waste to make sure all the things are in place for the NRC to get their minimum satisfaction that they're going to need. The NRC is very interested in Diablo running. I promise you guys, that won't be the issue. Will it be, for me, that Newsom loses attention if there's a really good few years of hydro? Maybe. I think that the disaster coming down the line for California electricity is so immense that it will keep attention focused on Diablo in an accelerating fashion, especially now that he is almost certainly going to be elected the next governor. He will be forced to deal with the entirety of the impact of the shutoff in the near term. I think that reality is setting in, and we are going to see continued action. In terms of building more nuclear in California, my God, I've heard of people involved in industry who want to do it. Not the nuclear industry, some of the dirty, I say that with love. We got a lot of oil people. I'm from an oil family. Some of the, say, refining industry people, maybe coal shipping people who are interested in nuclear in California, that's going to be a little trickier. I don't know if I'm hoping for the same turnaround on new nuclear that we're seeing on existing, and not because he won't be interested in it, because it will take a lot more active risk-taking politically and active competency, as opposed to the more passive process of just, in the case of Newsom and the deal to close Diablo, he was a major backroom coordinator of that deal. He won't say it in public, but we know it's true. We talked to the people who are involved. He just has to stop supporting the people who want the closure deal enforced. That's NRDC. Then withdraw his support from that and just kind of let the idea get pitched and let PG&E start working on it again and that sort of thing. For new nuclear, it's going to be a lot more active, intense effort, I believe. So I'm not sure if we're going to see more progress on that during his second term.
Yeah, I'll just say as a comment, I did a video commentary on San Onofre and what might come next. This was just me talking, and I'm far less involved in these issues than Mark, but it's kind of just a 20-30 minute overview of what might be some possibilities and might be like the issues if you're looking to do a new nuclear there. I am in the camp that I think one issue with nuclear is I think it is hard to, I think if you're going to do, I think there are exceptions like the TerraPower project. I think if you're going to do large nuclear, you probably need to do it at a site where it's already exists or has existed. And that kind of leads you back to kind of the incumbent operators and landowners. I'm not sure you would you'd be able to. I think a greenfield site, let's say in California, other than Diablo, other than San Onofre, I think would be quite a stretch at this point.
It'd need to be a community or a location that hosted something that was accepted for a long time as either economically necessary or even desirable. Hence the location of Kimmer in Wyoming for a new nuclear plant.
Excellent, guys. Well, I really appreciate the high quality of conversation here. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add or ask before we wrap up?
I just want to thank you for hosting this. It was a good conversation, I thought, today, so appreciate it.
I appreciate your guys' input too. What's that, FMT? Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's very like the panel is great, or the speakers, and to learn, to try to advance humanity is a great thing, and I think this is a really important thing they're doing, trying to get as many people as educated as can. So, we can all come around to things that can help us find some prosperity, like with the nuclear reactors that Mark's working on. And so, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for your input today, FMT, and Mark. Your input, especially, that was excellent. We haven't really been introduced before, but I feel like I need to pick your brain a little bit more and maybe get you on the show at some point.
Absolutely. Anyone's DMs are always open. Anyone can reach out if they have questions or comments or even critiques on any of our discussion.
Awesome. Thank you. Go ahead, Jim.
Could I please ask Bob if he's got an opinion on silver and gold here, an updated opinion?
Well, it looks like today was more about short covering. I think we kind of saw it. Buy stops were being hit, I think, on silver about every 10 to 15 cents. So you had some really bad negative sentiment going into these numbers, or basically all week long. I mean, you could cut the negative sentiment with a knife. So, at least right now, this is you can think of it as more short covering, but we are seeing, and it's been pretty consistent. The large buyer has not backed away from the market. Maybe retail has in terms of, physical products, things like that. But the larger investor has still stepped into the market and has been buying pretty consistently the last few months, and that's been the pattern really the last 3 or 4 years. So they haven't been dissuaded, by the inflation talk and higher interest rates. I think you could have almost seen the rally today was more based off the consumer sentiment numbers that came out about an hour after the inflation numbers came out, and that broke to a new low, and obviously, the consumers worried about higher gasoline prices, energy prices, inflation, a declining stock market. You kind of see the real estate market sort of cracking as well. So that's beginning to weigh, and I think gold's probably trying to picture whether or not, by August or September of this year, the Fed will basically be done. The market will probably collapse down, and it'll force the Fed to kind of back away from this tightening mode. And I think that's sort of that would be my guess, is by the fall, we have ashes, and then the Fed tries to start attacking, I guess, the recession again, and not necessarily the inflation. And so it seems like it's a political battle or a political sway that is going to drive their policy action. Maybe because it's an election year, but that's how I kind of see it right now.
Hey, Tom, one thing I'd like to say, and I love the precious metals. I really didn't get a chance to talk much about them, but anyhow, I think I can understand why many of the speakers or several of the speakers would look at what I'm saying as a glass half empty, or I'm Doomberg, right? But actually, what I'm looking at is we've seen this pattern over and over. We're just ignoring it. And, Joseph Tainter, who has given us, some very interesting information on the collapse of complex societies. You can get his book. You could go to YouTube and spend a couple of hours watching his presentations. We tend to get caught up in this specialization. We tend to get caught up in this over here and computer science and nuclear and fracking and EVs and all these engineers that are building these things. I can tell you many of them think they're actually doing something that's worthwhile. And so because they're kind of involved and lost in their own specialization. Now, what I tend to do is I don't specialize. I tend to look at everything and see how it's all working together. And so if you look at what's happened in the past, what a lot of the speakers are saying, well, we have more resources. Well, maybe we do. So what is that? My date is 2025. That's where I believe we're going to start running into serious problems with energy, with oil. I may be wrong, but that's my date. And I can be proven wrong. But if I am correct, as time goes on, the collapse of complex societies is just going to relive itself, just as Mark has been talking about, because as I mentioned in the last update, the last Twitter Spaces, the serfs in the 500 AD or 600 AD walking around these ruined aqueducts that the Romans built up, they totally lost that technology. And so while it seems like I am pessimistic, I'm actually realistic. The only thing that we can do is maybe postpone the inevitable by scraping up the remaining bits of oil here and there, and all those things. We may extend it a bit. I may get that timing wrong, but we're still going to collapse, because when you build up oil production at such an exponential rate, when you look at it over 100 years, any math person will tell you when something goes up exponentially, it doesn't continue exponentially. It collapses in the same fashion. And that's the way civilizations and empires build and die. So that's all I'm trying to add. And this, I'm not saying this is going to happen overnight, but a collapse can happen in the next 15 to 25 years. We could see a pretty good breakdown in our global economy due to the problems that I am seeing. And if I'm wrong, I will be first to admit it. I hope I am, because the ramifications are very negative.
Steve, you think that the metals, just to kind of round this back, the metals are such an important store of energy that you think that is a very helpful way to kind of protect some of the wealth through that collapse of the complex society, which is something that you and I have talked about quite a bit before on the show, right?
Yeah, and that's correct. And, again, gold and silver have been money, and I'm not saying it's an efficient way to use money, but they have been. And it's keep it simple, stupid. And the reason why is it takes a lot of energy to produce gold and silver. It's not just the raw energy, it's also all the equipment and the mine and the materials and the transportation of all that and the labor. That's all energy. So really a ounce of gold, the cost of it is about 90 to 95% energy and labor. And so when we realize that the market is nothing but using energy, that's what it really is. The economy is nothing but using energy and transforming it into goods and services. So when you figure that out, you look at all the money supply in the world, you look at all the stocks and all the real estate. What are they stores of value? No, they're not. They're energy IOUs. A stock is based on price to earnings. You better have continued growth. You have to have more energy, more growth to continue giving that stock its value. And we're starting to see that's falling apart now. Also, a bond, 20-year bond, 30-year bond, you need 20, 30 years of economic activity to pay back that bond. And then lastly, real estate. A lot of people have mortgages. Well, they got to keep working, fully employed, for 10, 20, 30 years to pay back that real estate. And then that doesn't even include when energy production declines, GDP declines, economic activity in the suburban town or city declines, real estate prices fall. So that's why I'm a big believer in the precious metals, because they are going to store energy value. They do not store energy. They store energy value, and they have been for 2,000-3,000 years. The world has just forgot about it. Some people are waking up. Most institutions are still believing business as usual. And so they're in stocks, they're in bonds, they're in real estate, private equity, all the financial stuff that is so overvalued. But I'm telling you, when the market wakes up, that's when we're going to see the movement into the metals, because it won't take long for people to realize, or institutions. You get a few smart institutions waking up and moving into the metals to protect wealth. That's how I see it playing out. That's still going to take some time, but that's how I see it playing out in the future.
Bob, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I really appreciate the conversations today. You know, a big shout out to the Canadian Oil Mafia. I've been on a number of their spaces and listened to a lot of their calls, and plethora of information. And of course, I appreciate Tom for putting this on. It's always great to learn. There's always a lot of different viewpoints, and that's what I always try to help with our clients. In the metal side of the world, try to understand not only why to buy, but how to buy, and then also how to protect yourself or how to own it. But just some great stuff today. I know this has kind of been a long one, but was definitely well worth it, and I appreciate everybody coming on.
Absolutely. I appreciate everybody's input here, and it's good to get more of a broader view than just the metals. It's good to hear about what could affect the metals mining. The input costs obviously is a huge component that is going to go into the metals going forward, and if that becomes a barrier to actually being able to get the metals out of the ground, imagine what that ends up doing to the price, especially if we do see some kind of, as Steve suggests, some kind of digital collapse of some type with this, the complexity of our society just reaching higher and higher levels. At some point, there has to be some type of backslide. I would think just based on the cyclicality of all of these things, right?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I think the metals guys out there, we may take energy for granted or not look at it as much. But I think at the end of the day, both energy and metals, we as commodity players, we look at things on a zero-sum level. And I think this paper world that we've seen, especially I've been in the business since 92, so I've seen a lot of this stuff. But you realize at some point this paper game's going to end. This debt creation and interest rate scenario and QE and QT and so forth. You can only play this for so long before it becomes unsustainable. And I think that's the commonality. I think that the physical metals world as well as the energy world kind of sees as, unless there's some type of your revision to policy, and we try to fix some of these structures, and especially get rid of this malfeasance and so forth. That's what recessions are supposed to do. And it's just a shame that the political paralysis is to keep the game going, and it only creates potentially more destructive behavior down the road. And I think that's what Steve kind of sees, is that this game can't continue the way it is. Otherwise, it's going to become more and more inefficient. But hopefully, if nuclear is one way to do it, that's great. And I certainly want to see the best for my kids and the younger generations to come. I think that's what this is all about.
If I could add one thing, Tom, that is that there's a classification of investors or traders out there that they look at charts. They're called technicians, and they kind of figure that all the news, everything is in the price. I'm not sure that I subscribe to that 100% myself. But if you stop and think that we had a good close today, we're around 1875 on the front month gold contract, August gold contract. Well, if you add, just 10% of that, another $125 or so, that's $2,000. The chart starts looking darn good over $2,000. And for whatever reason, if you're looking at a chart, and the chart type traders, if they start buying when it starts going over $2,000, then it's a win-win for everybody if you're long.
Yeah, I would also mention, the last 4 weeks or so, we saw a big degree, or I shouldn't say big degree, but we saw a consistent backwardation in basically all four precious metals. And that started to you started to see this is obviously before they rolled the contract or changed the lead month on the contract. But what you started to see was metal coming off the exchange. There just wasn't any incentive to hold metal on exchange and sell forward a futures contract that was actually yielding or less than the actual spot price. So that was some of the impetus that forced some of the, like for silver, I think it was almost 10 million ounces came off the exchange, 7 to 10 million ounces came off the exchange over the last couple of weeks. So there is you hit the price hard enough on the downside. It has second tier effects. And I think that's sort of the balancing structure on the physical world versus just shorting, a paper contract into oblivion. So I think just like the cure for high prices is high prices, the cure for low prices, low prices. And as Steve has kind of mentioned, I think following his charts, we're close to right at the production for silver among silver primary producers. We're right there in terms of cost of production. So that tends to actually put a floor in the market as well.
Bob, you're right. It's right now with $120 oil, the break even for the primary silver miners is close to 21, 22 now. The total price, total cost. And gold, it's 1550 or even higher. So that's where we get this 75-to-1 ratio. And the reason why it's different than it was back in the day or in the ancient times, it was more due to the wood and human labor. And now the energy has really changed the cost. It costs $1,500 to produce gold, and it costs about 22 to produce silver. That's 75-to-1. But these are the changing dynamics that are where we're going to start seeing get in a much different trajectory, because right now I'm seeing that JP Morgan and some of the ETFs, they're liquidating their some of their silver. It's been, I think the SLV has liquidated close to 30 million ounces in the last month, and the ETF securities just dropped 4 million. So what these institutions are doing, the guys who run this economy to get inflation under control. So why do I need silver? Well, you see, this is business as usual. This is like, why would the European companies want to buy natural gas in May of 2020? That's the reason why it was at 4 or 5 a euro for their TTF. It fell that low, and then it went up to almost $200 when they got into short supply. I see the same kind of dynamic happening with the metals. It may take some time, but right now, the financial institutions that are run by these real smart guys who are looking at business as usual. They're going to continue doing things, making decisions based on business as usual. And I see that really changing. So I just wanted to thank everyone. Tom and all these different speakers brought it some interesting insight into the whole what's happening, because if you listen to one person's going to say the exact opposite. So it's very confusing. But I think if we are going to get into trouble with energy, then a lot of the dynamics that are going to unfold, gosh, unfortunately, and I hope I'm wrong, the market is just not prepared for that. And even though the precious metals can protect your wealth better than many other assets, or I call them liabilities, they're becoming liabilities, we still got to eat food and we still have to do things. And, I think that's going to get very problematic. So gold and silver aren't the savior of everything. They're just going to, I think, hold your wealth. They're going to protect wealth in a world that's going towards energy scarcity. You're going to have to protect it. It's going to be hard to build wealth. Building wealth is over, I believe. It's just a matter of time.
It's one of the reasons why what I tell clients, this isn't a return on investment. It's now a return of your investment. And we see that with a lot of people, especially in the U.S., going, the last 5 years or so, 10 to 5 years or so, you saw this big push of foreign storage. You got to hold all your, maybe hold some of your eggs outside the country. And you saw that sort of growth in foreign programs, structured programs. Well, a lot of that metal is starting to come home because people are starting to realize that, not only with COVID and so forth and policy reaction from governments to shut down economies and shut down transportation, the cost of transportation has just had a huge impact on the movement of metals, and then also the accessibility of metals as well. So you're right. I mean, energy just has such a huge impact on not just the ownership of it, but also the ability to access it as well.
In that famous movie, the Margin Call that came out, I think they were portraying Goldman Sachs, right? So what the head of Goldman Sachs or wherever the bank was, they knew the subprime was getting ready to go into the toilet. So what did they do? They got all the traders and they offloaded all that crap as much as they could to save their bank. Well, you see, again, this is how certain banks or certain institutions, a lot of the wealthy in Europe, they understand gold and silver, but a lot of the wealthy, the new wealthy, they don't. They don't really understand gold and silver. The old wealthy do. So when institutions like we saw in the Margin Call, when that light bulb goes off, I think we're going to see some serious volatility in the metals, because look what happened today. The market sold off. You think the metals would, but the metals went up. So I think we're just in the beginning stages of seeing how real stores of energy value or wealth, how they're going to be readjusted in the future.
Yeah, you've seen the first quarter of this year. Also, you saw this massive increase in derivative activity amongst banks. JP Morgan, I think it was they went from about 30 billion in notional value in the precious metals category, which is basically silver, platinum, and palladium, to about 300 billion or so. Just a huge increase in derivative activity, and I've been digging into that, trying to understand. Okay, where is this? What exactly was driving this? What is it representing? And it seems like one of the themes that we saw was this massive sort of sales by Wall Street of these buffered notes. It became very popular. People becoming a little bit more maybe guarded against a pullback in the market. So Wall Street, of course, what do? They create the product that creates some type of buffered return, meaning you have some downside protection. Maybe the first 20% of market move down, you maybe have some protection against that, but you give up some of the upside as some type of buffer, and then you get some kind of yield out of it. And I think a lot of institutions may have jumped into that having some type of commodity exposure, but doing it through derivatives. The big question eventually is, a lot of these contracts are callable, so they're considered less than a year. So if the move starts to or the price starts to go against the issuer, which is also the price setter, which is, you could kind of look at it as the subprime market of the Big Short, when they're holding these contracts and the real estate market's falling apart, and they're asking themselves, why isn't my CDS going up? Well, same thing happens in these buffered notes that are put out by Bank of America, JP Morgan, all the big guys. They create the price setting, and it's all there in the contract. And I've read through some of this stuff. It's just amazing. I mean, it's the same thing over and over again, except they're selling a product to an institution. It's just, the question is, if people start to become more disenchanted out there and start pulling money back out of the market, there's no liquidity for these products. So if these products start to, or institutions start having to redeem and so forth, it could be the derivative side of the business could actually drive money toward the physical world. That's ultimately, I think that's going to happen. But I think that's where this big explosion in this derivative activity came from in the first quarter.
Yeah, and to add to that, the reason why I tend to look at silver as a much better, let's say, performance play in the future is there's just not that much more. And according to my calculations, looking at GFMS data for gold and silver bar coin demand over the last 20 years, and looking at what's in the ETFs and LBMA and COMEX and all these, the number I get is between 5 and 6 billion ounces. That is how much silver that somebody can get their hands on if they really wanted to and pay a high enough price. And that's 2 times the 2.5 billion ounces of central bank and private gold. A lot of the silver coins were lost over the last 100 years. They're just lost. And so a lot of this silver that we think can come into the market from a high price, from recycling, there's not that much really there. There could be some billion ounces, but it's just not much. And that's why when then the market understands the dynamics, it's same thing with, look at the oil companies when they were, Exxon was $20. I mean, it's a hit 100. It's so easy to look at Exxon back in, when it went to 20, or Chevron. But I see the same dynamic happening with the metals in the next several years.
I've been seeing that the COMEX has been supposedly delivering on a bunch of metal. So does that get you excited in any way? Does, when we see a lot of metal coming out of the vaults or being moved around, there's always a lot of talk about it on, let's say, Reddit or what have you. Does that mean anything to you guys when you're looking at those types of movements?
Well, I look at the physical side. I look at that activity as not only as a sentiment measure, but I'm looking at it through the lens. Ever since COVID came in March of 2020, you've had this systemic deleveraging ongoing in the futures market. Yes, there's maybe some times where you get some open interest, you get a big move in open interest. But if you look at the move from 10 years prior to COVID, you had an upward channel in activity of open interest and trading volume, and then that collapsed. And so to me, my theory is that we're seeing a deleveraging in the metals market, meaning the physical ultimately will be more of a price setter going forward. And the question is, when will it ultimately take over in terms of purely price movements? It's hard to say because the COMEX, oddly, a lot of people don't understand, but the COMEX is a seller's market. It is used as a hedging vehicle primarily amongst commercials, which is whoever their clients may be in terms of producers, fabricators, wholesalers, swap dealers, whatever it may be. They use that primarily as a way to hedge their physical position. The concern I have, though, is if the market starts to become less trusting of paper assets in general, and you've seen this where coin demand has been exploding the last couple of years. The physical market, even though coins, more metal was sold in 2011, 12, 13, you see this. I think the coin demand would have been stronger if we didn't have supply constraints, because I think our world, just like a lot of other industries, saw a dampening of available supply out there, and of course premiums going through the roof. And I think some of that premium structure was more profiteering amongst the industry, and that may have slowed down people going into physical metal. Why pay $15 over spot for a silver coin? But I think if the physical investor, or if the investor realized how easy it is to buy and sell physical metal, and how to use that from a counterparty perspective in terms of reducing counterparty risk and systemic risk, I think you'd have more openness from institutions to look at either buying the physical directly or through funds that buy the metal, so they can maybe hold it as a security, versus doing these derivative structures, which really don't have, they're really just a derivative off of maybe not even the physical. It's a derivative off of SLV or a derivative off of some type of structured note. That's what I'm trying to help institutions and high net worth families and family offices and individuals try to allow them to understand how easy this market is and how liquid it is. And, obviously we run a facility outside the financial system. We're one of the largest private facilities in the U.S. I also run a hedge fund that's in physical metals. So I'm kind of talking my book, but at the same time, my goal is to educate, whether you use us or somebody else. The main thing is to understand the market, understand the risks that are out there. Obviously the financial system is heavily leveraged. We all worry about, at some point, the Fed maybe tightens policy too much and the system really breaks, and then you have a banking crisis all over again. They're threading a needle right now, and I think that's the concern. And maybe the metals market started to realize a little bit, well, the Fed can only push too far before they really see some wealth destruction, and that really starts to hamper the economy. And that's why I think you probably saw gold kind of bounce today. It really was this idea that, hey, if things get so bad, the Fed's going to have to pull back. They're not going to be able to politically keep hitting the brakes, I guess, and killing asset prices. Even though, if their goal is to drive down oil prices, like we've seen, oil's been more of a supply issue right now than it is simply interest rates.
All right. You asked, is that what's going on with COMEX delivery? If I can just offer two answers. It's the cheapest silver and gold out there. There's no markup on it, none. When you enter into a contract, like right now, the front month would be August, but there is a July gold, there's a July silver, and it's the cheapest metal you can buy, 0.999, no, not 4 nines, 3 nines, 999 purity. So you do have to buy a 1,000 ounce bar, that's a mini, or you have to buy 5 1,000 ounce bars, but it is the cheapest. And then the second part that I'd like to address is that it keeps getting delivered, but that's because it keeps getting added. As mines mine silver, their deal or their contract is with a bullion bank, and that's the first tier of a 2-tier contract they've got. The bullion bank gives cash for the metal at a discount. They deliver it on the COMEX, and then they receive whatever they bargained for, whatever they traded for on the COMEX. So, of course, it's going to be an ongoing supply of physical, both gold and silver. I don't think anybody takes copper. But the lay person or the fund or, a wealthy family, if they want to, they can buy it from Bob, or they can take delivery via COMEX. They can leave it at COMEX and redeliver it. And the only thing I will add is that when you're taking delivery, your leverage goes away. You have to fully fund the contract. If you roll ahead, you can trade, let's say for all practical purposes, you can trade 5,000 ounces of silver, call it $10,000. If you want delivery of it, it's more like 120, 130,000, depending on the price, your trade price. But those are the two reasons, Tom. The bullion banks keep getting it from the mines, and it's the cheapest silver out there. That's why there's demand every month for delivery.
Allocator perspective, I would say the time is now. The time is right. This is the moment, right? For hard assets, gold, silver, and commodities. I see a multi-year bull market in front of us in these assets. I mean, if you game theory this out a little bit, the S&P to the gold ratio peaked against gold in 2018, but then the Fed backed off, and then the S&P did well again. And then 2008, 2000 hit with COVID. The Fed backed off again. The markets did well. But if you think about it from a game theory perspective, it's how did the central planners get the wealth effect to go back into turbocharge mode? They can't. And the reason why they can't, let's just assume the Fed backtracked today, started lowering rates, started printing money again, tried to reverse. Right now they want the wealth effect to go into reverse. They think that's going to cause demand destruction, which will lower inflation because the Fed is getting all this inflationary pressure put on their backs, as though it's 100% their fault. So let's just say the markets melt down to a point where everybody's at a pain point, including the Fed. Trillions of dollars, already $20 trillion in net wealth has been destroyed. So the Fed says, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to raise rates. In fact, we'll lower rates, just like they did in 2018. They can't really ever raise rates in any material way. So assets are down. The Fed says, okay, look, we got to get this wealth effect going back in the right direction. Because remember, we only had $8 trillion in U.S. national debt in 2008. Today, we have over $30 trillion. We've added over $13 trillion in debt in less than 15 years. The federal government cannot afford a massive asset crash. And so the Fed hits a pain point. They say, look, we got to get this wealth effect going north again. Because if we don't, the U.S. government's in big trouble. They won't have the tax revenues they already don't to pay their bills. Big trouble there. So let's get the wealth effect going back. Everyone gets head fake for a little while. Tech stocks go up. The S&P 500 goes up. Maybe gold dogs. But what happens in that scenario? Sudden what you've been seeing in the markets over the last few months is really interesting. But every time the markets have a bounce, oil has a bigger bounce. So if they tried to push the wealth effect north again, the only thing that's going to happen is it's going to keep driving inflation higher, especially with energy prices having no cap if they're just, pedal to the metal again. And which will put a cap on, economic activity as we're already seeing right now. And so there's just I just don't see any scenario at this point on a game theory perspective where this time isn't ripe for gold, silver, and other commodities. I mean, I do like other commodities too. I mean, it looks to me like any way I look at it from an asset allocator perspective, the time is now for these assets.
If I could add one quick statement to what FMT just said, if somebody said there's $1 to maybe $3 downside, but there's $20 to $30 to $40 upside. $40 upside would give you $62, something like that. Not unheard of when gold is going through 2,000 at the time. So from a risk reward, 1 to 2 or 3 downside, 20, 40, 50 upside. Possibly worth a look.
Well, and I had a conversation the other day that the guest was talking about gold going down to 1,500 and maybe silver going down to 17. I believe is what the possible targets were. And in my mind, while I would obviously like to see gold and silver higher, that doesn't really bother me that much because I know there's going to be some volatility between now and the ultimate kind of revaluation. And that much of a downside, let's say that's a just over 20%, 25% downside from here, I can't really find any
or I haven't interviewed anybody that has told me a convincing argument why gold after that would not be revalued much higher. And, gold and silver. It's hard to talk about one without the other, obviously. But when I think about exactly what Jim just mentioned, risk versus reward, I don't feel like when you're holding physical metal, you're holding an asset that is going to lose 100% of its value and never come back, much like we just saw from the Terra Luna collapse.
And Tom, I agree, because we're seeing cracks in the silver market, and I always like to look at the data, because I can speculate on anything, but when the data changes, or when the numbers change, or the demand or the dynamics change, that tells me something. And so it all changed in the pandemic when ETF and physical silver demand exceeded industrial demand for the first time. That was the first chink in the armor. And so now the second chink that's happening is I just reached out to the U.S. Mint. He is the head of the communications of the U.S. Mint. And I asked him, I said, why are you unable to, increase sales of the U.S. Silver Eagle, even though the premiums are high? And I knew the answer, but I wanted him to tell me. And it's the answer is there is a shortage, tightness of silver shot that makes the smaller silver blanks that the official coins use to make the official coins, as well as small bars, 5, 10, 1 ounce bars, kilo bars. They need the silver shot. And because of the technology of using silver shot in manufacturing, it's been very, very tight. That's the second crack that's taking place. Now, it's starting to loosen up a little bit, but if the silver price fell, this is what's interesting about when the markets sell off, people sell. When silver falls, people buy more. It's one of these weird things. And so the next thing is we're going to see another tightness in the silver bullion market. There's going to have premiums are going to go back up. And then the chink or the crack that I want to see, and Bob will tell you the same thing, is when there's going to be a tightness and shortages in the wholesale market of the 1,000-ounce bars. We haven't really seen that yet. And when that happens, that's the game changer. And that's going to really fundamentally change the precious metal markets as well. I believe more financial people are going to start opening up to the metals. So I just wanted to share that information.
I totally agree, Steve. And, guys, chime in here as you please. But what are some of the symptoms of us starting to see that shortness in the 1,000-ounce bar market? Is it lease rates going up? Is it premiums? Like, what are some of the signs that we're going to start seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, you see. Well, lease rates would be one of them, but you'd see the EFP. You'd see that backwardation starting to build, and backwardation is not just simply maybe a demand for the physical over the future, some type of future contract, but when you see backwardation, it actually starts to increase financing costs. So that actually impacts wholesalers or dealers as well, because it's becoming more expensive to finance actual physical versus maybe, for example, what they could hedge with or buy from the mint or from their distributor or refiner 2 or 3 months out. So there's multiple impacts when you get into backwardation. I just think that you haven't seen the euphoria. I mean, a lot of people point to 2021, the silver squeeze movement and so forth about, that was euphoria. That was the retail capitulation. That was them what the silver squeeze movement was basically the industry making a fortune on the back of the consumer. And there's a lot of instances of massive profiteering that went on during that entire event. Yes, it was great to see a lot of interest in silver, but the premiums were just unheard of and obscene. What we need to see, I think, is and I think it'll come, is when you start to see that 1,000-ounce bar market and the traditional investor or maybe the bigger investor says, you know what, I really don't care about the coin as much as I really care about having some participation and some physical exposure. Just buy me the cheapest product out there, and that's where the 1,000-ounce bar is so integral to the silver price. It is really the silver price. I mean, the COMEX trades it, the LBMA trades it, industry trades it. Everything's based off of it, in terms of ETF demand, fabrication, and so forth. So if you actually start to hit, you start to see true demand coming for those 1,000-ounce bars, which we take delivery from COMEX. We've taken delivery from programs around the world. We can see that demand coming in, and it's one of the reasons why, for us, for example, we will buy 1,000-ounce bars if premiums get too high on other products, because it makes more sense to just get simply more metal for your money. But I think as more people wake up to the ease of being able to pull metal off the COMEX and go through guys like Jim that can exercise and deliver, take delivery of the warrant, break the receipt, take the metal itself, and whether you're holding it on the COMEX or at a COMEX custodian in the eligible category, or you simply just pull it out of the COMEX system altogether and take delivery back to a private vault or to your house or whatever it may be. You start to see that is the equivalent of a run on the bank. And that's where this derivative activity, which is sort of leveraged against the physical product, starts to work in reverse. And I think that's where you start to see this break of paper controlling the physical or controlling the price. People won't be apt to simply just start hedging and selling against physical metals as much, because at that point, either leverage or liquidity of shorting a contract may become more illiquid when you're trying to roll back out, like we saw in March of 2020 when you had gold, you had the issues with mining and COVID kind of coming on, and everything kind of came to a standstill, and you had the spread between London and New York shoot up to like $60 or $70 an ounce, and you had HSBC lose like $90 million in one day. There are second-tier effects of derivative products that start to break down, and that's where you see the price start to take off. You see a lot of that with mining companies. I mean, you saw Barrick Gold lose $3 billion or so hedging back in the mid-2000s just by getting that wrong, by trying to protect themselves, but their hedge book blew them up. And then they had to actually raise capital to pay down that hedge book loss. So, but those are things that I would watch for.
In support of what Steve was saying, when he talked to the man at the mint that makes the Silver Eagles, they can't get the blanks because there's a shortage of silver shot. Stop and think of what Steve is telling us. The coin with the highest premium in the nation right now, it's like $13 to $15 over spot, can't get silver. So it just it's very, very interesting that Steve, confirms with the representative from the mint that things are tight.
Well, there's a bit of profiteering though, because if you look at the mint sells the Silver Eagle to its distributors for $2.95 over spot. I look at this industry partly is the industry has become scalpers at a rock concert, and these guys are selling the tickets outside the stadium for a lot higher than what their actual cost is and what they traditionally.
I agree with that 100%.
And that's the part, I think, if you didn't have the premium structure as high as it was, I think you would see more people enter into this market and participate. Yes, there would maybe be as much product available because we have had shortages of blanks across not only the U.S. Mint, but also production issues with the Austrian Mint and the Royal Mint as well the last couple of years. But that's where people tend to go to bars afterwards and start to buy other types of physical. To sit there and tell someone to buy gold and silver or silver and it's a 40% premium to spot, I mean, it's hard. It's a hard sell. I mean, it's hard to get the consumer or the investor. You might as well just buy an ETF at spot and just trade the.
Unless you know a guy, Bob. Unless you know.
Yeah. But on average, though, for the mainstream investor, it's that wants to maybe make a move into precious metals. It's it's easier or it's cheaper to simply go into an ETF, and they don't understand.
Do you guys have a sense of when we might see kind of a split of the metals really getting hit along with the stock market? Obviously, today we saw, gold was up a pretty reasonable amount after a pretty big hit first thing in the morning. And then we saw the GDX, the GDXJ, both up almost 5%. The SILJ was up over 5%. Do you think that people are starting to catch on to the, quote unquote, fail safe nature that is the metals, or how do you guys look at that?
I don't think, Tom, you can say it after one day. Use today as an example. Both metals have been coming down over the last 3 to 5 weeks, let's say. And
and that's what I'm asking is
gold a couple $100 and silver like $5 or $6 came down. So I think we'll need a little more proof, but that's kind of why I mentioned the notion a little bit earlier in the discussion that those that watch the charts, when gold starts taking out $2,000, and that might happen who knows when, but you just watch the chart, and when you'll see it on the news if it hits 2,000. But there'll be people that are buying then. Some people that are buying, that they dollar cost average, they're buying maybe, every Friday or one month, one day a month, whatever. In answer to your question, I don't think you can say that today is that we turn today. I would like to see a little more evidence of what you're asking.
I totally agree, Jim. I wasn't saying that today was evidence, but I'm just wondering, like, where you think that turning point might be, where we see that capital inflow come out of some of the other places, or if we just get too much destruction, and where we need that capital to come into the metals.
I think the right answer might be that there's a whole flurry of fund managers that watch performance because their paycheck and their bonuses are tied to it. So if we start seeing the GDX, which should be 40 already, if we start seeing it trade to 50 and 60 on the GDX, the respective gold companies are doing, red hot work because gold is 2,050, 2,080, or First Majestic trades $20, $22 because silver's $35, $37, something like that. I think the evidence for the fund managers that run the big money, and that's what you need. You need fund flows from big operators. Small guys don't move the market, but the fund flows do, and the futures do. And I think that's the key answer to your question. When the managers, the guys that control the money, when they start seeing outperformance by these particular indexes, SILJ, GDXJ, GDX, that kind of thing. That's my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Jim.
Well, you also have, money goes where it's best treated too. So right now, the trade du jour, I guess, that's been working is basically the energy trade. A lot of people, it's the one true trade that's been treating people the best, obviously. And so it attracts a lot of the money, and money attracts more money. The metals, everything kind of moves in cycles. And if metals start to attract a bid, for example, if gold just stops going down and the market continues to go down, for example, that may start attracting people to the asset class. And we may have seen that. I mean, a good article with David Einhorn and Greenlight Capital talking about how he sees gold going much, much higher. I think the physical guy treats the market a lot differently than the trader. The physical guy is looking at it saying, hey, listen, I really don't care what happens, 3 months from now. I care what happens 2 or 3 years from now. So we're not as worried about day-to-day volatility as maybe a short-term trader is. And I think that's what the physical world, I think, represents more of, is sort of that longer-term approach. And I think that ultimately can start to sway the market because the more people go in the physical and less go into some of these derivatives and so forth, it attracts more attention. You don't have the liquidity as much in the derivative the derivative trading volume, and so these bids, the prices, when they get shot down and shorts try to press their trade lower and the physical market wakes up and starts buying, that's actually what supports the market more than anything. And then that actually starts to set the shorts, putting in the buy stops, and then they start to back out of those positions. I think we saw that a little bit. We saw some really big volume the last couple of days with physical players coming into the market. And I think, today was a great example of, buy stops being put in and buy stops basically starting to hit on the way back up. And then those actually kind of coupled and just ran on to the upside. Silver was, maybe every 10 or 15 cents you had buy stops being hit, drives the price up a little bit more. Same thing on gold. So, Jim's right. You got to see the retracement. You got to see what the market looks like on some type of pullback to see how strong that pullback actually is, and how supportive the market is on that pullback to determine, okay, because a lot of times a big move will start from short covering, and then from short covering, then you have investors coming into the market, and then also you have traders that will also come into the market at the same time. But those traders and investors provide that fuel for the next move higher after the short covering burns out. That's what we're all trying to watch for. And at the same time, you're walking into the summer months now, where traditionally you have lighter liquidity. People go off on vacation. Europe goes on vacation, and traditionally it's been a slower time of the year. But oddly enough, this is also the time where the metals tend to bottom is in June, July, and then they start to work themselves up. Whether it's going into Diwali or for India's buying season for metals or that type of activity, you start to see Asian demand maybe start to pick back up. So you have this cyclicality or seasonality that starts to come into the calendar year also.
And after a $6 or $7 sell-off too, from $28, and from gold we were $2,000, a little higher than that if you go back a little further. So we had a nice pullback. So maybe it's just things got cheap enough for some traders to bid today. That's possible.
Yeah, and I would say you don't want to take too much from one day trading session, but it was really interesting the way it gapped down on the inflation print when it hit 8.6%. And then as the day progressed, it shot up. And I think that is a real reflection, though, of perhaps larger investors losing confidence that the Fed can get a handle on this. Because asset prices are, the housing markets is already in certain pockets is already seeing some severe distress, some record sort of activity with mortgage application declines and these other things. And then you have massive falls in certain segments of the stock market. And so how much can the Fed truly tighten is a question, given how quickly things are unraveling. And so the initial reaction, I think, was like sort of emotional, like, oh geez, they're gonna tighten like never before, because inflation's worse than it was 3 months ago. And then the realization, like, wait a second, maybe the Fed can't catch up to inflation. Maybe the Fed can't really raise too much because they'll completely crush the economy, and therefore, government tax revenues and their already pernicious debt situation. And so I thought it was a really telling market move today, though. Again, time will tell. And I think, somebody worried about these short-term moves, I just wouldn't worry about them personally. I'd take a long-term view at this point, because it looks to me like it's definitely, the world has moved in the direction of hard assets. And so that just was my quick takeaway. I thought it was interesting, market action.
Yeah, it's important to note, trying to keep it simple on that front. The Fed, if you obviously the dollar has been sort of the cleanest dirty shirt in the laundry, I guess you could kind of say, because every country has debt and so forth. But if you just look at fiat money in general, I've never seen a fiat currency go down because of deflation or that the currency has shot through the moon, and that's created a failure. It's impossible for our debts to ever be paid off with fewer and fewer dollars and a stronger dollar policy. It's just right now that the Fed is tightening faster than all the other central banks right now, and they're sort of that's actually helped the dollar gain strength out of the gate here. But the problem we run into on the flip side is the higher interest rates go, the more the debt servicing costs of the U.S. government are going to rise, because when they go to refinance their debt, they're going to be refinancing at higher rates, and the Fed obviously isn't there to buy that debt. So the market's going to demand higher prices, because that's a lot more debt that's coming onto the market. Not only do you have $1 trillion deficit, but you also have the Fed not being the buyer of last resort. So it creates a loop within itself that all of a sudden higher interest rates now start to increase, more money coming on, more debt coming onto the market, which will actually start sapping the market strength. The market will become a funding vehicle for the U.S. government, and sort of that crowding out effect, which it's an old term that you haven't seen in a long time because the Fed has been doing QE for so long. No one understands what crowding out effect is, but you're about to see it. When the U.S. government, luckily we had some really strong tax receipts the first few months of this year, and especially going into April 15th. But those tax receipts, the withholding taxes now are starting to decline, which is also a sign of potentially, the economy starting to recede. And so, if tax receipts start to go down or start some type of secular pullback on top of the economy pulling back, on top of the Fed not buying debt, that's going to create potentially more deficits, and that's going to create more demand for the Treasury to go into the general market. So these all have these second and third tier effects on the market, and that's why the Fed can only probably tighten for so long before the market just doesn't have any more money left. They just start, it's just the way the structure. And now with higher rates, you have the competition between the 10-year yield and the S&P 500 dividend yield. It'll be more competitive for an institution to go into a 10-year note and take their money out of the stock market at that point. So you have this continual run on valuation.
Sorry, Bob. I was just just trying to have a little bite to eat here. It's
sure. Oh yeah, no problem.
It's been a long call.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think those like you say, those second and third tier effects are really important to consider. And once that momentum, as Jim pointed out, once that momentum kind of comes into the market, all bets are off, really, right?
Yeah, I think the physical metals world, I think we just, like I said earlier, it's a zero-sum game to us. At some point, this pushing or kicking the can down the road, eventually the piper has to be paid. The dollar ultimately is the release valve or relief valve for the markets. That's typically the game. How fiat currencies usually work is ultimately the currency is devalued at some point. The problem we have right now is as you have this sort of debt deleveraging that's going on in the markets right now, is assets are being sold off to pay down debt. And so you have complete wealth destruction. And at the same time, if you have quantitative tightening, you're going to have money basically go to money heaven, where it was created out of thin air. Now you got the exact reverse that's happening. So that's an additional headwind to the market. And that's not something most people or many people in the market have seen, especially anyone who's been coming into the markets since 2008 or say 2010. They haven't seen, maybe 2018, we had a little bit of a liquidity event. In 2020, it lasted for 2 weeks. But in terms of the type of leverage that we've done since 2020, the Fed doesn't have as much room as they may think they have to tighten. I mean, the market had a screaming fit in 2018, and you had to have Powell just completely reverse course out of nowhere, and so that's the part that it seems like everything's being more and more compressed because of leverage.
Hey, I've been listening to. I agree with all this information, and this is going to be my last my last remark. And I will be checking out. I want to thank everybody. Before I talk about a little bit about silver to end this, you can always go to the SRS Rock Report. I think it's important to understand the changes that are happening with energy, because they'll tell us what the direction, what's happening. It'll impact everything else. But the question you brought up, and we've had a lot of responses, is what are we going to see to make this change in the metal prices? And what it's been, it's not what I think, it's been the change in the flow of ETFs. If you look at the World Gold Council, they just came out with their May 2022 gold flows. And if you look at their monthly chart, you look at their quarterly chart, and you look at the flows of gold into the ETFs, and you look at the price, when the gold flows go in, the price goes up. When the gold flows start coming back out, the gold price comes back down. So you don't need to be a brain surgeon to figure out institutions control 80% of the market, and this is where they move. This is where the high net people move, whether we agree with them or not. So it's to a lesser extent the same thing with silver. And so and right now you're seeing a weakness in silver because right now we're seeing larger institutions are getting out of silver. But I looked at the top 15 holders of the SLV, which is, they hold about 600 million plus or minus. They're the largest. Their average allocation, and this is what the financial guys, they'll talk about, what are we going to allocate our assets in? Well, the average is 0.25. It's not even it's a quarter of 1%. But the big guys, the Morgan Stanleys, the Bank of Americas, they're like 0.05 or 0.009. To get them up just to 0.2, which is still a fraction, that's going to be 5 times what they own right now. And so this is the issue I see. When these institutions start waking up, it's only going to take 1 or 2 of them. When 1 or 2 start waking up, then there's going to be more movement into these ETFs and gold and other ETFs. And that is the dynamic that is going to change the silver price, the silver market. And if the speculation is that the JP Morgan doesn't have all the silver or these ETFs don't have all the silver, that's not my problem. That's these institutions that put their money in there. That's the lawyers to solve. And if there isn't the silver in there, what do you think that's going to do to the silver price if it gets on CNBC? So I welcome this movement into the metals. I welcome institutions buying physical. I welcome people buying physical. But the real fireworks are going to happen, as has happened in the last 15, 20 years, is when institutions move into the ETFs, gold and silver. That has been the main driver of price. That's going to be the explosion. And then I see physical coming on in the later stage. And then it's going to be a physical market determining the price as the time goes on. But I just wanted to add that because that's what I'm seeing happening in the market. And I want to thank everybody. And again, you can contact me at the SRS Rock Report, where it's important to keep an eye on what's happening with energy.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks very much for your time today and all the info that you shared with us, Steve. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. You guys have a good day, and everyone too.
You too, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, I think it's important also to note, on the ETF front, the last few years, you've seen institutions create these ETFs that, you talk about SLV, which is a very common ETF, but Barclays came out with this. You've seen other types of DB fund, DB Silver Fund, Deutsche Bank. They create these ETFs and slap the name silver on it. But in reality, what they are is, they go into the treasury market, buy a 5-year note or whatever it may be, 2-year note, and then they buy a bunch of options that gives them some type of notional value that replicates the price of silver, but then they spit out some type of yield off of that, or they just simply raise, like Barclays, for example. They have a silver fund that simply just goes into the market and buys futures contracts, and partly what we saw, like we were talking about in previous spaces, where people weren't aware of it, but when you had that big rush in after the Ukraine invasion, and of course with Canada doing their thing with taking people's bank accounts, you had a big inflow of money coming into the ETF space, Barclays especially, and Barclays had accidentally, or I don't say accidentally, but they had oversold or sold too many unregistered shares of these ETFs, and they had to post some type of loss or unwind, and that may have sparked some of the selling that we saw going into April, was some of that unwind, because they just took in a lot of this money flow without properly registered shares. So there's a lot of games that are played. It's obviously it's up to individuals to really know what they're investing in, as well as institutions. But you'd be surprised some of the institutions that are out there, they're looking for convenience, and as well as, they're looking for security, because maybe that's what their charter says. They just can't simply go into the physical commodity. So they need some type of security or product that they can go into. And that's where Wall Street is sort of like, chomping at the bit for that kind of money, because they'll create that product for them.
Yeah, great point, Bob. We've touched on that before, and it's so much a matter of educating yourself, and that's what I appreciate again about doing these spaces, and especially what you're doing is just bringing this stuff to investors' minds, because just because it says silver doesn't mean it is silver, or that there's no counterparty risk associated with it, anything like that. And when these markets actually get into trouble, the whole point of having gold and silver is to guard against those types of issues. And if you have invested in something like that isn't backed by any actual metal, or you're not actually holding it, the cards might not be all on the table, right?
Right. There's a lot of games that are played in a lot of these structured programs. I mean, it's obviously you got to read the agreements, which I really stress upon. You got to understand the difference between an unallocated or pooled type of a vehicle versus an allocated vehicle versus a fully segregated type of program. And that takes you into a litany of rabbit holes as well, because even in an unallocated type of program, you don't know how those programs, it may not cost you anything for storage of the metals, but in reality, what you're doing is you're creating a liability. The program that's taking in your money is basically using your money for balance sheet operations or some type of financing vehicle, so they can actually take that metal and lease it out, constantly bring new metal in and try to roll that metal forward using your money. So it's important to understand a lot of these types of programs, because I think as we see liquidity tighten up, and this is where I started to see this with programs over in Singapore, especially the last 6 months. Singapore, great example. The government went to a pretty strict lockdown. Singapore was very popular for storing metals. In fact, we store metals over there for clients. You started to see the bids sort of evaporate, the cost for shipping over there, the cost for shipping back, the available cargo space on commercial flights becoming more restricted. It just became not as efficient to transact, if you're, for example, you're a U.S.-based citizen or so forth, to buy metals over there and have them shipped all the way over there. Because if you ever need to have them shipped back, or you go to sell, the bids are much weaker than they are here in the U.S. And I think those are important things to look at when you're looking at foreign programs, is not only the user agreement, but also the liquidity, because that actually turns into a risk down the road that most people may not be aware of. I know, the site that people could go to our site under the media section. I've done a number of these interviews, even with you, Tom, where I have slide decks and so forth, talk about different types of a full slide deck of risks that you should be considering and looking out for, and understanding when you choose a depository or choose a structured program, what to ask for, what to read in the agreement and understand, and how limits of liability clauses and these sort of other types of hold harmless agreements, how they can be used for the sponsor's advantage and against your own interests. So that's the part where I just don't want to see people get hurt trying to protect themselves, and that to me, that's the most important thing. And in the physical world, unfortunately, it's not a very heavily regulated environment like it is in the financial markets. So there are a lot of players out there that tend to take advantage of individuals, and that obviously adds to not only more risk, but it gives the industry another black eye every time you see something hit the papers. We've seen some massive, almost 9-figure lawsuits developed by the CFTC over some of these gold dealers. Just recently, you hate to see that happen. Gold is known as honest money, but at the same time, there are some very dishonest people that are in this industry. So, definitely try to shop around, don't assume that there's a lot of great people that are in this industry. There's a lot of great people on Twitter to follow and to learn from, but just try to expand your knowledge base.
Agreed, Bob. And you and I always have our DMs open if anybody does have any questions to be able to help just show people where those resources are and kind of help them along. I think we can wrap it up for today. It's almost another 5-hour space, so never seems to end of interesting conversation and good quality information. So I really appreciate everybody's input and time today.
Definitely. I appreciate it. I think we went through a full bull and bear market cycle in the metals while we've been talking about this. I appreciate I appreciate the oil mafia. I appreciate Steve for getting on and Doomberg earlier, sharing a lot of great knowledge out there. I've certainly learned a lot about the oil space. Obviously being a metals guy, energy is not as maybe looked at upon, because my job is more of protecting people's assets, holding it outside the system, that type of thing. So a little bit more focused on the physical metals world, but certainly there's a lot of great spaces out there. It's one of the beautiful things about this spaces events is you get a chance to interact and truly learn from a lot of people that just want to share a lot of good knowledge.
Excellent. Thank you for the conversations, guys.
Thanks for your input, FMT. All right, guys.
Thank you for having me. Have a great one.
That's going to wrap it up. Thanks to all the guests and speakers that we had today for all their time and knowledge, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate Jim too. I forgot to mention, he's always great to have on, and definitely gives a lot of color on the futures markets. He's an expert at that.
Yeah, always great to have Jim join the conversation and give us live price updates too. All right, guys, have a good weekend.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.